So for those of you who don't know who Proofpoint is, Proofpoint is primarily an anti-abuse company. We've been working with a lot of the MNOs in the US primarily around business messaging management and how they can actually get visibility into their business messaging. And so I'm going to talk a little bit around the business messaging security and the different types of protections. Not necessarily protections that you would think of with regards to fraud coming through the typical business messaging channel, but more along the lines of the fraud that is generated via impersonation and things of that sort, right? So not necessarily your AIT type of fraud, but more so the fraud that actually gets the consumers to think that they're communicating with a brand when they're actually communicating with fraudsters. So one of the things that I'd like to reiterate from some of the conversations or some of the presentations that happened this morning was around SMS and MMS and why that for commercial messaging. The reality, from a messaging point of view, it is the true ubiquitous channel to reach all the consumers. Marco alluded to that a little bit ago with regards to the chat apps, et cetera. It is the one way to get a hold of all the consumers out there that have mobile devices. Pew Research, actually January of this year, put out that 97% of all people over the age of 21 can be reached via a mobile device. The 3% that's in there largely is the 65 plus, and if they're likely not your target audience anyway. So realistically, 100% of your reach is going to be via SMS, MMS for commercial messaging. And as Marco pointed out again, with regards to the chat apps, it's typically going to be your most economical for majority of your commercial businesses. So a little bit around the fraud, right? The risk and cyber risk that comes along with that. 74% of all the breaches, this comes from Proofpoint Research, is due to the human element, right? The human element is what gets people to execute to where the fraud comes, or where the fraud is perpetrated, if you will. So they do recon, right? This recon can be anywhere from buying lists on the dark net. They can be from harvesting from games, apps, things of that sort. And they get that initial list of folks to reach out to. They reach out to them with that initial compromise. It could be something as mundane as a hey, can you walk my dog this weekend? Which is the beginning of a conversational spam. It can be a make money now. It can be the IRS scams. It can be various different things. But it's that initial I got you. From there, there's persistence. We've had threat researchers that have actually went through some of these scams, and they've spent a week, 7 days, interacting with this other person on the other side. Could be a bot, could be a real live person, could be whatever. But they've interacted for over a week with these guys before any kind of call to action has come into play. And during this time, they're gathering info. They're getting additional information on you. They're trying to pull on your heartstrings, if you will. So it's a lot of this is leading up to the whole how do they get you, right? What's the call to action? Could be they realize they discovered halfway through you lost your job. A family member lost their job. Oh, I can help you make money, right? And here's how I do it. And They can show you this legitimate app to download, and next thing you know, you're compromised. It could be, and from a compromise, it's how do they get to you, and as a brand, perpetrating a brand potentially, right? So it all comes back into how do they get it. So realistically, what does protection mean within the ecosystem, right? For an enterprise, what is it that the enterprise wants? They want that impersonation prevention, right? If an account was taken over, how can that be identified, and that fraud that's potentially delivered through that account stopped? And then the other thing is, how is the enterprise messaging perceived, right? What does the consumer think of that enterprise messaging? From a CSP or a content service provider, a campaign service provider, did they acquire a poor account, right? Did somebody come in that has bad sending practices, downloaded lists, what have you, right? Again, same thing with account takeovers, right? Are my customers being compromised and a bunch of stuff is coming through there, right? Because that damages their reputation. That damages their ability to send the rest of their customers' messages into the network. And again, how are their customers being perceived? There's certain CSPs out there that will acquire any customer. And we know who those CSPs are because we see a lot of that bad sending practices coming from those CSPs. And then from an M&O point of view, what does protection mean to them? How is the brand, the CSP, perceived by their subscribers? Are they behaving the way they should? Are they following my code of conduct? Are they following my acceptable use policies? And am I getting pressure from the regulator to improve my messaging? So challenges of some of the challenges of OTT. End-to-end encryption with things like RCS and things of that sort, it really blocks out any kind of ability for a filtering solution because it's end-to-end encrypted. Through the A2P channel, majority of what we see through that A2P channel is legitimate. We're not saying that you shouldn't look at that at all, but majority of it is legitimate. The challenge is, if it's encrypted end-to-end on the P2P channels, you can't see the impersonation. That's the problem. It's not 100% ubiquitous. As we've heard a couple of times today, SMS and RCS is 100% reach. And then omni-channel becomes increasingly challenging. So a lot of your enterprises, a lot of your brands have to figure out what channel they do want to contact you by. And for some consumers, in the event that you contact them in multiple methods, can be confusing. And that opens the door for fraud. And then your sender authentication varies greatly, right? We've heard a bunch of people talk about that today. So we kind of look at security as an ensemble. It's a collection of various different things that we look at. We look at, from a content perspective, normalization, right? Removal of obfuscations, things of that sort, to look at the actual content. Is it trying to impersonate anybody? And by anybody, it could be a brand, whether it be a financial institution, an investment company, a retailer, what have you. And then through that, there's threat detection, right? Systems that are trained to look for that type of obfuscation, that type of fuzzy matching, if you will, to identify those brands. Message clustering. You look at the numbers that are sending very similar content. From an A to P perspective, if a number is sending a lot of the same content over and over and over, that's typically a good thing. If you're seeing numbers that are not on A to P channels sending very similar content over and over and over, that's potentially, that's something to to take note of, right? Because it's potentially trying to impersonate a brand or commercial messaging. So looking at that content to see, is this trying to impersonate anybody? And then using things like abuse feedback from the 7726 model, the iOS report junk, using that data to see what is coming through, and using that to train engines to identify malicious content. Behavioral analysis, being able to look at traffic patterns. Are you seeing the same type of content coming from 100 different numbers? That's a traffic pattern, a behavior that's not indicative of good behavior. Identifying patterns, characteristics from content clusters. Those, being able to look at a content cluster. Are there multiple URLs, multiple domains being used as call to actions in very similar content coming from a vast number of originating numbers? That's, again, indicative of malicious content. That is typically not seen in an A to P channel. And a lot of the, from a sender point of view, again, identifying the stuff that does not appear to be on a non-A to P channel, does not appear to be P to P interactions. That makes sense? So one of the things that has worked really well in the US is that we've identified is a registry. Doesn't necessarily have to be any particular registry. However, something where a brand identifies these are the numbers that I'm using to deliver content. And then applying additional attributes to that. This is the type of content that I'm sending. These are the call to actions that I'm using within my content. These are, this is the volume of messages that I'm anticipated to send. All of those help the anti-abuse vendors, such as ourselves, to basically weed out or eliminate, move aside the legitimate traffic. Not necessarily ignore. You still want to validate to make sure that they're doing everything that they're saying they're doing. But it gives us the ability to really focus on the stuff that isn't registered and potentially impersonating a brand. So really a registry in and of itself, not necessarily to make things more difficult, but to ensure everybody understands what the messaging is or should be. And that's my presentation. Questions? Boy, I'm really quick.
Any questions?
Anybody?
We've gone hyper warp speed, I think.
Exactly.
This afternoon. There's a couple of tired-looking faces out there, and I think
I think everybody, yeah.
Great, you can get coffee. So, any questions for Michael before we close out this section?
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. So glad to know that you're keeping us secure at Proofpoint. Thank you. So we're going to have a short break now till, well, almost an hour, so 4:30 we'll come back. We've got Google this afternoon, and we've got a really interesting session as well following that, which I'll tell you a bit more about later. So back here in around about 1 hour. Thanks, everyone.